Just west of Reading lies the borough of Wyomissing, a classic suburban community of 10,000 people. With tree-lined streets and well-appointed homes, this is the real-life version of Bedford Falls, the fictional town from the film classic It's a Wonderful Life.
Yay! Hello, Bedford Falls!
The history of Wyomissing began with a vision led by two German immigrants, Ferdinand Thun and Henry Janssen, who came to Berks County in the 1890s as young men and formed a textile company that became a legend called Wyomissing Industries.
They were doers. They made things happen.
They had a really marvelous opportunity, not only to build their business, but to spend their time and money building all of the ingredients of a real community.
The story of Wyomissing is about neighbors working at one of the biggest hosiery mills and machine shops in the world. It's about company patriarchs who cared about the products they made, the people who made them, and the community they shared.
The borough of Wyomissing is what it is because of those gentlemen. They had the foresight to see what this community could be, and they made it happen.
Thun and Janssen made things to last, whether it was a factory or a home, a business or a neighborhood. In many ways, their story is the story of Wyomissing, an American dream.
Wyomissing, an American Dream is a co-production of PBS 39, the Wyomissing Foundation, the Berkshire Charitable Foundation, and the Henry Janssen Foundation.
The first chapter in the story of Wyomissing begins across the Schuylkill River in the city of Reading at 226 Cedar Street. Father and son, Frank and Joe Lewes, own and operate Barbette Industries in this machine shop built in the 19th century. Today, they make braided products and fringe on some of the very same machines which Thun and Janssen began developing in 1892.
This is one of the buildings that Thun and Janssen got their start in back in the late 19th century when they went into business. And they were here for, I believe, 4 years before moving out to Wyomissing.
Two 26-year-old immigrants, both educated in the textile industry, Ferdinand Thun and Henry Janssen, formed a partnership and began making braiding machines in this building. What they may have lacked in money, they made up for in skill and determination.
It's amazing to me that they could come up with the math to make the gears mesh, the pockets of the horn gears line up, and the teeth of the horn gears line up, and it makes the pattern that they want it to, and it comes together on the central gear that drives the whole machine, and it doesn't crash, and it runs smoothly, and they did it all by pencil. It's just mind-boggling to me, but they did it. It's really cool.
They manufactured and serviced machines for companies that primarily made brush braid for women's floor-length dresses, the fashion of the Victorian period.
They had braid on the ladies' collars, on their hats.
Barbette has Thun and Janssen machines that are over 100 years old and still working like new.
Over the years, we've had new foreign-made machines in our plant. And we can wear those out in a few years' time. It's the quality of steel that goes into them. Whereas what Textile Machine Works, it was a very high-grade steel. And if you maintain them, oil them, lubricate them, they show very, very little wear. They'll run for another 100 years.
Thun and Janssen didn't rocket to success. They had to convince American textile manufacturers to trust American-made machines over the ones made in Germany, which were considered the best in the world in the late 19th century. Thun and Janssen learned their trade in Germany. They grew up in the city of Barmen, a major hub for manufacturing textile equipment, including braiding machines. Henry was born on February 8, 1866, and Ferdinand was born on February 14th, just 6 days later. Thun and Janssen, who grew up only a few blocks from one another, had middle-class educations at local technical schools. Thun focused on business, and Janssen studied mechanics. Ferdinand Thun came to America in 1886. and began work as a bookkeeper for Lewis Kramer's woolen mills in Berks County, Pennsylvania. Henry Janssen immigrated to New York City shortly after graduating from technical school in Barmen. Toone and Janssen lived parallel lives that intersected more than 3,800 miles away when they first met in New York City in 1889.
It's a mystical, magical experience here that these two men were born within 6 days of each other, only a half a mile apart, in the same city called Barmen, but a city that had its own identity as a braiding capital in Germany.
George Edmonds, who grew up in Wyomissing and wrote the book Wyomissing: An American Dream, marvels at how these two met. Toone and Janssen became fast friends, formed a partnership in 1892, and moved to Reading, where they began weaving their small company into an empire, which would ultimately become Wyomissing Industries.
They sat at opposite sides of the same desk for years. Mr. Janssen was very technical. My grandfather was financial. In terms of their abilities, they were clearly complementary.
Toone studied English shorthand and was a voracious reader. Janssen was more the hands-on guy, according to his great-granddaughter, Liz Rothermel.
Mr. Janssen was get out there and do it, get out there and fix it, and if I can't fix it, I'll find someone who can. That's what he did.
Both Toone and Janssen enjoyed traveling the world with their families as they grew more successful. But essentially, they had very different personalities. Their greatest common characteristic was an obsession with perfection.
Janssen was known as a man who did not put up with bad workmanship. There's a quote in my book about Janssen coming back from a summer vacation, overviewing some repair work that was done, and said, "Do it right. Make it right. Start over again."
In 1890, the United States began imposing the McKinley Tariff on foreign-made machinery.
So this gave them the golden opportunity to start making their own American-made braiding machines.
What they wound up doing for the first 3 years while they were in Reading was actually gaining more experience with the machinery and repairing the existing machinery.
In 1895, they got their first big order for new braiding machines.
They realized that they weren't going to be able to fulfill these types of orders in the future in such a small facility.
In 1896, the Reading Suburban Real Estate Company offered the partners several acres along the Lebanon Valley branch of the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad in Wyomissing for $1, hoping it would bring workers and spur residential development. By September, Toone and Janssen were up and running in Wyomissing.
They moved their business very quickly. This was the same year that Toone got married. That was a very important year for him, 1896.
By the turn of the 19th century, Toone and Janssen had a growing business and families to support. Ferdinand married Anna Marie Grebe. They would have 6 children. One day, their twin sons, Ferdinand Carl and Louis, would fill their father's shoes at Wyomissing Industries. Henry Janssen married Wilhelmina Raker of Lipspringe, Germany, and had 4 children. Janssen's son-in-laws would later enter and succeed him in the family business. But in 1896, Toone and Janssen were 30 years old and struggling to keep their fledgling company afloat.
They had an investor who oversaw their business, who said to them, "You're in financial trouble, and I am willing to give you some money, but I think what you should do is start using those machines to make what the machines make, namely braid of all kinds." So that was the beginning of the Narrow Fabric Company.
In 1900, they officially named their business the Textile Machine Works. They also created another firm called the Narrow Fabric Company. It made elastic braids for garters, corsets, and hosiery. It also made shoelaces.
Skirts went up and dresses got more simple, so the market for lace changed to industrial, and that's when they started producing covering for electric wire and then subsequently hose.
While Narrow Fabric made braid products, Textile Machine Works, or Textile as it became known, made the machinery for it, and continued making machines for other competing braid companies. David Toone, Louis Toone's son and Ferdinand's grandson, possesses Textile's early sample books.
It includes many, many samples of braid that customers would send in asking the company for a braider that will make this.
Thun & Janssen erected this building in the mid-20s just for the Narrow Fabric Company, which operated here until 2011, when under different owners, it went out of business. Perhaps the most pivotal year for Thun & Janssen was 1899, when the Nolde & hosiery mill in Reading almost burnt to the ground. The company asked Thun & Janssen to fix its fire-damaged, full-fashioned knitting machines.
Thun & Janssen wound up with these repaired knitting machines that were improved by Mr. Janssen. Then they decided, well, we better put these machines to work. And we start making stockings. And that was the birth in 1906 of the Berkshire Knitting Mills.
Berkshire Knitting Mills, named after the English shire for which Berks County got its name, became Thun & Janssen's third company. That same year, 1906, they incorporated all three companies, Textile, Narrow Fabric, and Berkshire, under the name Wyomissing Industries. The Berkey, as locals called Berkshire, manufactured women's full-fashioned hosiery, which at this time was made primarily of shiny mercerized cotton. Silk would supplant it in the 20s. Gustav Oberlander, who joined the partners in managing the Berkshire, would learn every aspect of the silk trade.
And Oberlander was a good businessman, and he also became an expert at buying silk. He learned the trade rather quickly as it grew and grew and grew and grew.
The company hit its stride as women's fashions changed dramatically in the 1920s.
Skirts went all the way up, almost to the knee. They were making 1,000 machines a year at that point.
It was the era of jazz, flappers, and speakeasies. Americans lost their inhibition in the decade of prohibition. They partied, they danced. They flocked to the theaters to see suave leading men in dapper jackets and ascots, and starlets in sultry dresses and full-fashioned silk stockings. Berkshire grew rapidly as demand for full-fashioned hosiery skyrocketed.
They became the largest stocking manufacturers in the world, as we like to say it.
Thun & Janssen filled the demand for stockings with a powerhouse called the Reading Full-Fashion Knitting Machine.
Well, the basic, famous Reading knitting machine always boggles my mind when you realize they had 130,000 parts. Now, to put those all together is a masterful thing to do.
Textile companies worldwide purchased the Reading, and Textile sent the machines and skilled craftsmen called erectors to install and service them.
They conquered the textile industry. They really did.
Between 1922 and 1925, Berkshire Knitting Mills rapidly expanded with construction of 6 buildings, including a 5-story finishing building, a general office, cafeteria, and full medical dispensary. Today, the complex is home to VF Outlets.
Morey Avenue, which is now the main path through Vanity Fair outlet complex, used to be lined with cherry trees. It was quite a sight come cherry tree blooming time.
In 1926, Oberlander retired from Berkshire and joined Thun & Janssen in forming the Wyomissing Foundation as an enduring way to provide philanthropic support for causes they considered important. Later, they split. Thun kept the Wyomissing Foundation while Janssen and Oberlander each created their own foundation. In 1930, Oberlander and Thun created the Carl Schurz Foundation.
The Carl Schurz Foundation was an idea of Ferdinand Thun to have some kind of exchange program between Germans and Americans to build international goodwill.
In addition, Oberlander established a trust to fund the foundation's academic and cultural exchange program.
It also included money for Einstein to come to America.
With their philanthropic organizations established, the men focused on the company's need for educated workers. In 1927, Textile established an education department to train machinists, electricians, tool makers, draftsmen, pattern makers, die makers, and more.
It became like a junior college. They had a 2-year program with a degree, and a lot of the better students then automatically would go to Penn State.
It evolved into the Wyomissing Polytechnic Institute. In 1957, Penn State University acquired the institute and made it the Penn State Burke Center. Later, Janssen's daughter Helen willed her parents' Tulpehocken farm, which included their summer home and barn, to the university for what became the Penn State Berks campus.
He'd have picnics here. He'd also entertain a lot of his people from the companies.
Dave Boucher's dad, Earl, who worked for Wyomissing Industries, remembers his father meeting with Mr. Janssen at the barn.
He would say, Earl, come up to the barn. And Dad would trot up to the barn and have a discussion with Mr. Janssen about whatever it is was on Mr. Janssen's mind. And I guess that was the beginning of whatever project was next.
Today, Penn State uses the house as an administration building and the barn as the Janssen Conference Center.
It's just grown tremendously because the campus is very large, and they put dormitories in and got full degree programs.
The Toon family also contributed to the school, which included funding for the Toon Library on the Berks campus. Toon and Janssen's interest in an educated workforce was trumped only by their interest in their workers' livelihood. During the Great Depression between 1931 and 1935, the Berkshire lost 1/3 of its business, and for the first time, it had to lay off workers and shorten the work week. Toon and Janssen redeployed many of their workers to home construction projects throughout Wyomissing rather than lay them off.
In spite of the Depression period, somehow they kept things going. They did have a downturn, but I think after 1936-37, things did start to pick up again.
But the company also faced another big issue in the 30s, the push to unionize. In 1936, 7,000 members of the American Federation of Hosiery Workers, which included 800 Berkshire employees, waged a 13-month strike to unionize the mill.
There was some ugliness, cars were destroyed, but the company had basically tried to give the workers pretty much what the union was already offering.
One non-striking employee was killed in the confrontation. Strikers accused the company of instigating the violence, and the company blamed it on the strikers. In the end, Berkshire remained non-union. The 30s proved a tumultuous time for America and Wyomissing Industries. And on top of it all, that same year, Janssen's wife Wilhelmina died, as did Gustav Oberlander. The next decade of the 40s proved even more tumultuous as global events led to a Second World War. During World War II, from 1942 to 1945, Wyomissing Industries produced products for the war effort. Berkshire made gloves and socks for servicemen.
They did make the cords for parachutes and the narrow fabric.
If you go aboard the John W. Brown, the Liberty ship in Baltimore, you will find on one of the guns, the gun control unit, manufactured by Textile Machine Works, Reading, Pennsylvania.
Wyomissing Industries employees supported American troops by purchasing war bonds made through payroll deductions. During both World Wars, Toon and Janssen, like many German immigrants, faced anti-German bias in America, even as the two men supplied the United States with war materials. Toon and Janssen always cherished their German heritage while embracing their adopted country. After World Wars I and II, they helped German citizens in need of food, clothing, medical supplies, and more. By the close of the 1940s, Wyomissing Industries stretched across 60 acres along the Reading Railroad.
If you ever walk through those buildings there, you cannot see from one end of the floor to the other. It's that gigantic.
Toon and Janssen built their mills and shops to last for generations because they expected their company to last that long.
They are solid. There's absolutely no question about it. They built like they were going to be here 100 years later, and they are.
So to think of all these large knitting machines going and humming and people, thousands and thousands of people working in there is just phenomenal.
Toon and Janssen offered progressive employee benefits even by today's standards.
Everything that could possibly be done to support their employees was done. And it was the premier place to work, the largest employer for decades.
Toon and Janssen paid for the Buttonwood Bridge to connect Reading with West Reading, which made employee commutes much easier.
Mr. Janssen and my grandfather built a bridge and gave it to the city. And said, okay, you're responsible for maintaining it.
The partners insisted on cleanliness and a safe working environment. Even their huge foundry with molten metals and blazing furnaces was kept spotless.
We cleaned the walls and the steel work, go on the roof and scrub the monitor windows. We'd clean all that up. It was a clean foundry. It was well kept. They got awards for their foundry.
Every building had plenty of light and ventilation.
The foundry, I'm told, was the only foundry where windows were cleaned every week.
Among Wyomissing Industries' 4 cafeterias, Berkshire's was the largest. It fed 1,200 people in 20 minutes.
They had the cafeteria that fed all the employees. They worked 3 shifts. It was a round-the-clock operation.
The Easy Spirit Shoe Outlet now occupies the building which once housed the Berkey's cafeteria.
That's where our cafeteria was, and that was a huge building. And that's where everybody met. You met with your friends in there.
Oh, the atmosphere was wonderful. Everybody loved what they were doing because we were treated so well.
Marcia Nair, who worked at Berkshire from 1957 to 1961, remembers the medical benefits.
We had access to the dispensary. Anything medical that we needed, we received free of charge.
The company also had an eye doctor and a dentist. It had its own fire department and security force, which often served the borough of Wyomissing.
Under every building that they had, the tunnel system existed because all the utilities were accessed with that.
Running power lines and piping through these tunnels kept the surface environment pristine.
It was very advanced for its day. When Disney went to Florida, one of the innovations was putting the utilities underground, doing the underground passageways, etc. And that was long after this was done in Reading with the Wyomissing Industries.
Wyomissing Industries brought employees together with the company newsletter.
The Yarn Carrier was published in volumes pretty close to a monthly basis for 27 years.
It highlighted all the goings-on throughout the industries, from wedding announcements to news about outstanding employees.
It was very positive. Whether you were a secretary in the main office or a knitter, everybody took pride in what they did.
These men were community-oriented.
Toon and Janssen brought that same sense of community to the borough of Wyomissing. Even today, you can see it reflected in Wyomissing's annual 4th of July parade.
The 4th of July parade is symbolic of the community that they built.
The parade has been drawing people together for more than 100 years, when Toon and Janssen watched over the community like 2 doting parents.
The kids are in the parade, the marching bands, the fire engines. There's a contest, decorating your wagon, and the bunting and American flags everywhere.
I can remember decorating my little tricycle with crepe paper, and other people had their bigger bicycles, or the cars were decorated, and they had this wonderful spirit of coming together.
I mean, full of hers and mine.
The parade leads to a park where the whole borough congregates.
It's a really Norman Rockwell sort of thing.
It's like one big community family reunion.
It is known as the 4th of July parade, and it does reflect the patriotism and pride of the Toon Janssens and Overlanders, and their belief in American democracy.
In 1906, when the 4th of July parade began, Toon and Janssen led the formation of Wyomissing as a borough. Both were council members, while Toon served as its president for nearly 40 years. Today's council meets monthly in Borough Hall, once the Toon family home. The parlor is now council chambers, where portraits of the 2 founders grace the walls.
I kiddingly have said many times that we have those 2 big portraits of those 2 gentlemen in our borough council chamber, and I often glance over there and think, my job is basically don't screw this up.
Chip Carrison, Ferdinand Toon's granddaughter, remembers going to her grandparents' house.
It was Sunday lunch. We're going to our grandparents, and you have to behave. So I was a little intimidated. Also, they had in their doorway, they had that big brown bear, the umbrella stand, and he was probably almost as big as me, and I was scared to death of the bear.
Ferdinand Toon's grandson, also Ferdinand Toon, who now owns the once intimidating umbrella stand, remembers his grandfather's understated yet commanding presence.
You know, I don't think I ever saw him without a coat and tie. There were a number of big family dinners and so forth, and so he was always at the head of the table or in the center of the picture.
Recently, Ferd discovered a letter his grandfather wrote to him on the day he was christened in 1934.
I was the first male grandchild that came along. He said, Ferdinand's a good German name, and I should be proud of that, and I should resist the urge to anglicize the last name.
As Toon and Janssen grew their company, they developed the Wyomissing community.
They built 500 houses for their workers and associates in the community.
They created the Wyomissing Building and Savings Association and later Delta Realty in the early days of the borough for their employees.
They did not just the boulevards where the big fancy houses are, but all the side streets. There's very affordable housing.
Well, I used to play in this front yard.
Dave Boucher, the mayor of Wyomissing, has lived and worked in this community all his life.
There were blue-collar homes, yes. I mean, I considered my home that type of home. There were bigger homes on the boulevard, more value and so forth, catering to a different clientele. There was diverse housing available.
Toon and Janssen founded the Wyomissing Development Company and hired city planner Dr. John Nolan between 1923 and 1932 to help plan the borough. Nolan had studied under Frederick Law Olmsted, the man who designed New York's Central Park.
They had this vision of suburban development that included a planned community with tree-lined streets. And it has evolved into the fact that the borough has 8,000 street trees that are owned and maintained by the community.
The extensive park system that is around here, most all of that park system came from the Toons, Janssens, and the Oberlanders.
Mr. Janssen and Mr. Toon took strolls every Saturday to determine whether or not the sidewalks were good and the paint was right and the trees looked right, and if not, they'd have it fixed. They were just incredibly generous people.
The partners helped Reading Hospital move from Reading to West Reading along the Wyomissing border in 1926. They funded a nurse's residence in 1930 and served on the hospital's board of directors.
I've heard stories that things were going on at Reading Hospital and they would have a plumbing problem or an electrical problem, and Mr. Janssen would go over there, assess the problem, and he'd send people from Berkshire or Textile to come and repair it.
The Reading health system as we know it was driven by the industries putting things together. The Reading Public Museum was driven by those three families in its creation.
In the 1920s, Toon, Janssen, and Oberlander helped move the Reading Public Museum closer to Wyomissing and more accessible to the general public.
So we have 25 acres, we have 5 buildings. The original museum building from the 20s as well as the original greenhouse are still obviously in use today, and those date back to the days of Toon and Janssen.
Toon, Janssen, and especially Oberlander contributed artifacts they had acquired in their world travels for display in the museum. Mrs. Toon and Mrs. Janssen also donated to specific community projects.
Mrs. Toon was definitely the driving force in having a library in our community. She not only put forth a lot of time and effort, she also supported us financially, very generously. We actually have over 8,000 registered borrowers in our small community of 10,461 people. A good majority of our community are members at the library and utilize all the services we have.
Toon and Janssen also gave land for the Wyomissing swimming pool in the 1920s. In 1932, Wilhelmina Janssen provided the pavilion for Wyomissing's Happy Hollow Playground.
Oh, the big sliding board, good heavens. It was a 2-sided sliding board that was way off the ground and was quite a feature.
I was a beneficiary of all these community treasures that we were able to take advantage of, having books, having a swimming pool, having a playground.
Toon and Janssen shared a business and civic partnership that lasted for 56 years, until Henry Janssen died in 1948. Ferdinand Toon died 14 months later in 1949. Special editions of the Yarn Carrier memorialized the partners.
They closed textile, you know. I think they closed all the industries the day of the funeral.
After the founders died, Toon's twin sons, Ferdinand Carl and Louis, with Janssen's son-in-laws, Dr. John Livingood and Richard Wetzel, along with other officers, took the helm of Wyomissing Industries. They filled the gap at a difficult time. The company hadn't recognized the market trend toward seamless nylon stockings. The DuPont Company had developed nylon and made nylon stockings available to the general public in May of 1940. 72,000 pairs were sold the first day. The federal government used nylon for parachutes, tents, and other war materials during World War II, and nylon stockings became scarce at that time. After the war, nylons came back, and their popularity soared.
Women didn't want a seam up and down. It was too much trouble. Keep it straight. They didn't need a fitted foot like that.
Changing to seamless meant creating a new wave of circular knitting machines.
The guys were very hesitant to embrace this change. They thought that the seamless stockings were basically just a fad and it was going to go away.
By the mid-50s, the company had started mass-producing seamless nylon stockings.
But by that point, they were behind, and it was very difficult for them to catch up. They eventually did, but they really lost a lot of business in that period.
By the mid-60s, Wyomissing Industries began capturing the market again. But in 1968, the Toon family sold textile to Rockwell International, and the Janssen family bought the Toon share of Berkshire. In 1970, the Janssen sold Berkshire to Vanity Fair, which shortly thereafter changed its name to VF Outlets and pioneered the idea of outlet shopping. People offer various reasons for the textile giant's demise. It failed to recognize the fashion trend towards seamless stockings, and that put them behind the competition. But it also might have been time for the families to move on. The mills and machine shops still stand in silent tribute to Wyomissing Industries. VF Outlets proved extraordinarily successful. Busloads of shoppers poured into the complex for 45 years.
We had as many as 400 buses a day coming in on a weekend to visit the outlets.
VF Outlets continue selling from the old mill buildings, though not with the robust business it once enjoyed. In 1988, Rockwell International sold its braiding machine business to David Toon and Paul Kozloff, who formed Magnatech International. Toon and Kozloff have since retired, but Magnatech continues as a leading manufacturer of industrial and hydraulic hose.
Magnatech, still doing well. It's been sold 3 times since then.
Rockwell moved out of Berks County in the late 80s. The old textile buildings were subsequently adapted for reuse as restaurants and businesses, including a hotel.
You look at those buildings, they were built to last. They were first class. They are today in wonderful shape after all these years. That's another testimony to the discipline in those 3 men. We're going to do it, and we're going to do it right, and we're going to do it to last.
You can find Henry Janssen and Ferdinand Toon's gravestones in the Charles Evans Cemetery in Reading. But the true memorial to these men lies in the community they developed, the foundations they established, and the example they set.
They had the foresight to put money in a foundation. They had the foresight to recognize that the communities were very important. After all of those years, with that legacy, you have to say, now, what would those gentlemen be looking at today in this community for us to do?
Today, the Wyomissing Foundation, directed by community members and fourth-generation members of the Toon family, support community needs in the 21st century, especially in Reading and West Reading.
We are talking about job development, job training, job creation. We are talking about enhancing neighborhoods.
The Wyomissing Foundation has supported environmental efforts such as the Schuylkill River Greenway and the Berks Nature Conservancy. Since the foundation began, it has given more than $40 million in grants.
The Henry Janssen Foundation lives on today in our community.
Liz Rothermall continues the Janssen legacy by serving myriad community organizations in Berks County and overseeing her family's foundations.
Our side of the family created the Berkshire Charitable Foundation. We have monies coming from Henry Janssen Foundation and Berkshire Charitable. His works are continuing on.
The trees that shade Wyomissing have stood in place for more than 100 years. They didn't just grow there, they were planned. Like the streets and crosswalks, like the parks and schools, like the stately homes and everyday houses, Toon and Janssen made these happen. They led the way with ingenuity, determination, and drive, always with drive, and always in sync. They designed a machine, a company, and a community, and made them all work together.